Thank you for joining us today to learn what can be done to improve the chances for homes to survive wildfires. Our speaker today is Yana Valachovic, and Yana is the County Director and Forest Advisor for the University of California's Cooperative Extension in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. She is a registered professional forester and a forest scientist whose skills and interests cover a wide set of natural resource fields. Yana is currently the co-lead of the Northern California region of the California Fire Science Consortium. She is a founding steering committee member of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. Yana has co-authored papers on fire behavior in coastal California forest and on the intersection of fire performance in home and landscape design. With the 2017 North Bay fires, she has been leading UC Cooperative Extension's education work in fire building performance, and she is keenly interested in helping communities learn to build smarter. So for today's presentation, please type your questions into the chat box, and Yana will address your questions at the end of the presentation. And at this time, I'm anxious to learn more about this subject. And now we're going to hear from you, Yana.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us in this seminar series that's put together by Humboldt State University. I'm excited to share a few thoughts with you all and see if I can stimulate some, at least mental conversation and a bit of dialogue in the chat. I asked, if you haven't noticed the chat, to let us know where you're calling in from, and just what I'm seeing so far is that we've got folks from all over the state, a lot of folks in the coastal regions of California, so that's exciting to know that we've got a pretty broad audience. And so today I'm going to talk about gardening, I'm going to talk about homes, home design, and wildfire, and sort of what do we know now, what are the key lessons, and is there anything we can do about it? I know a lot of us feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the home loss issues that have happened in California over the last several years, and I think when I talk to my family members and other members in the community, a lot of people feel defeated. And what I hope to do today is maybe bring a little science and inspiration together to be able to talk about what we can do. And I'll share that I made a typo this morning. I know it's in the middle of COVID, and it'd be much more fun to do this in person. So it's July 123rd today, which is I guess how I feel. Like I got a meme a while ago, and it said it was March 58th, and that I think corresponded to about mid-May in reality. But we're kind of in time standing still in this moment of COVID. So we're going to live with this webinar format. I like that we can talk to lots of folks, and I hope to create some engagement. So thank you for working on the chat there, and let's see what we can do in our efforts with Zoom and make this work. So I want to start with an opening question. I think we all have heard the terms defensible space and fire, and maybe a few of you have heard home hardening, and there's a lot of challenge in getting ourselves to be motivated, and it seems to me that most motivation comes when there's smoke in the air and people feel an imminent threat. And so I'm curious, at least intellectually, what might be holding you back when it comes to dealing with these issues? And it might be, maybe the question or the other perspective is, well, my neighbor's not on board, so what am I going to do about it? Or, their tree is the problem. It's not, things that are happening at my place. It's all these things around me. Or why should I even try? I mean, look at this image on the left. My home has too many issues. I can't get in front of it. Or is privacy really what's the determinant, that you've been really trying to think about how to keep your neighbor's views and prying eyes off your place? Or is it, you live on the coast and you go, hey, it's not going to happen to me. So what is it that's holding you back? And you feel free to, put that in the chat if you'd like, because I think these are, the real issues. What does it take to deal with the things that feel far away, feel not imminent? We're dealing with trying to keep our health and safety together, and we are moving into fire season. So what are you struggling with? So today I'm going to talk at a relatively high level about what we know about how homes burn. I'm going to then drill into both the landscaping and the vegetation, both in the near home environment and in the more wildland setting. And then I'm going to do some review, just high-level review about where the challenges are in homes and what are the things that we can do. And I'm mostly going to be talking about homes that are already constructed, but if you happen to be a fortunate individual that's thinking about building a new home, there is so much that you can do that doesn't cost very much that makes a big difference. And I'll conclude with some resources. And there's a lot to this, but what I hope really to do is start that conversation with you and your family about the actionable items that you can take on and the pieces that are achievable and where to move forward. All right. So to get there, I need to sort of distill a couple of terms, and so these are going to be like the biggest vocabulary terms that you have in this seminar. But fire comes to a home in 3 different ways, and we need to think about them in distinct formats so that we can, or distinct exposures, so that we can try and best mitigate the exposure that they present. I think most of us are familiar with the idea that there's a wildland fire that burns from the landscape to my home, and that provides direct flame contact where the flames actually come all the way to the house. And some of you may be thinking about this idea that wind distributed and driven fires have embers or burning bits of vegetation or your neighbor's home that can be picked up in the air column and moved forward. So taking that, again, that wildland setting where you have a fire in the forest and the wind is carrying bits of vegetation, and those bits of vegetation are already engaged in fire, and those land on the house. So embers are another piece that we have to be thinking about when we're thinking about wildfire preparedness. The third component is radiant heat, and that is where the fire never actually touches your house, but the heat from the surrounding vegetation or your garage or your outbuilding reaches a high enough temperature that you can cause combustion on your home. So all 3 issues are really paramount when we think about how to protect our homes to the best of our abilities. And I think most of us have been stuck in this frame of thinking about just how to interrupt that direct flame contact to the house. So I'm going to spend time today talking about all 3 types of exposures, but really drill into the ember piece, because that's what has contributed to the majority of home losses, more than 60% in these bigger fires that we've seen where we have lots of homes being lost. So here's an example of what I mean by embers, and this is from the campfire, and you can see that it's almost like a hailstorm of intense exposure of material going all over the place, and in this case it's almost moving horizontally across the parking lot into the next building. These embers are so pervasive in some situations that they can find the littlest weakness, and the place that you think that something's not going to get lodged, the embers are able to get lodged. So reorienting towards the type of exposures that you might see with embers is a bit challenging, but we know some new information about them, and we've got some new building materials and design concepts that can both mitigate existing construction or be better incorporated into new construction. So here's an example. This is from Lake Tahoe, from the Angora fire a number of years ago, and this home was burned. But why isn't that the vegetation is perfectly intact? Why is the vegetation perfectly intact? In this case, the embers were able to find a nook and cranny or penetrate one of the vent systems in this house and cause the house to seemingly burn from the inside out. So this is the challenge that we have to incorporate and develop an appropriate response to. Here's another example from Santa Rosa, and you can see that, and this is in Fountain Grove, and you can see that a lot of the vegetation is barely touched in these fires, but yet look at all the homes that are lost in this Fountain Grove community. This is on the east side of town. And then here's one from Southern California, and you would think that this house had all the right defensible space. Yes, there were flames and there was combustion in the vegetation surrounding the broader wildland setting, but with all of that lawn and cement and even walls in some way, how was it that this house was lost? And that is difficult to answer in a post-evaluation, but we've got some pretty good information to be able to understand how those losses are occurring. So now I'm going to drill into defensible space and landscaping and bring forward kind of the way that we've typically been talking about this. And California has a defensible space code, and you've all seen it, lean and green. The idea that it goes to the property line and that, you're trying to mitigate the path of fire that might be coming this direction towards the house. So there are two zones, 0 to 30, and then there's a 30 to 100 foot additional fuel reduction zone. So let's think about this for a second, and what does that set us up for? So this is California law, and I'll just say, there's a lot to this, but the idea is, you need to think about where your home is placed and the spacing between trees and shrubs and the vegetation in general will increase a bit when we start talking about steeper slopes or taller vegetation or particularly fire-prone ecosystems. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but this is where we've been at with our typical defensible space education. And so the idea is that you're reducing the amount of vegetation so that you can interrupt the fire. And if you have fire in the green parts of the trees or the crowns of the trees, that the fire may lay down and just more gently come across the landscape as it approaches the building. And the flame lengths will be appropriately reduced when it does that, so that it's possible to respond to that fire. And so, the goal in that style of defensible space is to reduce direct flame contact and create basically a safe place for the fire crews. And what I want to say, it's really more defendable space than defensible space. The idea that you can safely put, a fire truck, a fire engine, and a set of crew to be able to defend your home is really the strategy that we think about when it comes to the type of defensible space education we've done. So the fire comes out of the forest and the crowns of the trees, the green part of the trees, and comes down to the ground, and the flame lengths are reduced, and it's possible to do direct attack. And that works for a lot of the fires that we experience. But when I first laid out, we have to be prepared for direct flame contact. We also need to be prepared for those embers, and we also need to be prepared for the radiant heat exposure. So in that model, does that cover all of what we need to do? And I'm going to argue that it doesn't, because Ember defense requires both landscaping modifications and home hardening, and embers can easily overwhelm that typical defensible space strategy that we take on. And they can pass over that, just like they can pass over the 8-lane freeway in Santa Rosa and move from one side of the freeway to the other. Embers are very successful at moving, even up to a mile or more. And depending on what they find, both on the house or near the house, they can create new fires both on or near the house that will create direct flame contact to the house, or penetrate the house, or even create an exposure through radiant heat because they connect in a close outbuilding on fire. So thinking about embers requires that we change how we think about defensible space. So this is an image from our Master Gardener collection within the University of California, and it's one of our example photos of what we thought 15 years ago was really good defensible space. So, I mean, at first cut, look at this. We've got mowed grass, we've got trees that are limbed up, the canopies don't connect, we've got a nice green lawn surrounding the house. Everything looks great, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. Look at this combustible vegetation that is next to the house. And embers are very likely to pass over this nice typical fuel break and be able to create exposures right next to the house, leading to these spot fires, leading to then something larger. So what I'm arguing here is that the way we've done things in the past may not be how we want to think about going forward. So how do we balance all of our aesthetic interests, our privacy interests, how do we think about this? So what you're going to see, at least in our shop within the University of California, is a reorientation towards working from the house outwards. So the problem is not one of my neighbors, it's not one of the wildland as much as it is about what can we do right next to the house. Once we've accomplished that, then how do we push out into the farther territory around the house or to the property line. So we're talking now about a 3-zone system, more than we have in California before. The names are going to change a little bit. We're working on some code changes that will lead to some of this, but the new concept is that in the zone right next to the house, out 5 feet, is some of the most important area that is going to contribute to the survival of your house. So what can we do in that place? And then we'll continue with the fuel modifications and the lean and green zone and the modified fuel zones as we have, but we need to incorporate in this idea about what we can do right next to the house and how that's going to prepare us to be able to defend against the house against embers. So here's an example from Marin County. They've done a nice new graphic illustration of this multi-zone concept, and you'll see that it includes any attachments. So the attached stairs, the attached deck. So this zone is the entire perimeter around the house. And then there's the typical 0 to 30-foot zone, and then 30 to 100-foot zone. I will say what Marin's doing very nicely in their education work is they're also thinking about an access zone, and that is the access zone for fire personnel to be able to get in safely and effectively. They want to make sure that your house is one that they want to defend. So if you're down a long driveway with lots of overgrown vegetation, they might not risk their own personal lives and safety to go down to your home. So that access zone is really important for them getting in. But even more importantly, it's for you and your family to be able to get out. So the house plus the access zone and then the surrounding vegetation. So these are the kind of new terms you might, and new graphics that you might start to see coming forward. So I want to drill in and show you a few examples of why this is important. So this is from Paradise. This is a home that's built to the new construction code standards. So in 2008 became the implementation of the I'm going to call the Wildland Urban Interface Chapter 7A construction standards, and it has a lot of guidance around what you can do in the house to make small modifications when you're building new, to be able to be more aware to all these types of fire exposures. The codes, however, have been silent around any additional components of defensible space modification. And so this home is a survivor. It's in a community where many homes did not survive, but it was built to the new construction standards, and it performed relatively well given the type of fire exposures. And what you can see, though, is that there's a lot of use of cement around this house. Makes it easy to get in and out. There's a nice green lawn, but there were a lot of combustible mulches used and a lot of combustible vegetation that was placed right next to the house. And so what happened, and here's some embers, which I can show in my hand here that I found that it extinguished in the green lawn. The embers were being thrown at the house. It ignited the combustible mulch. It ignited this woody vegetation that had been planted. And every one of these windows has a crack in them. The first pane failed. The good news was that the whole window didn't fall apart and the second pane wasn't penetrated, so fire didn't enter the house, but there was a lot more exposure than I think I would like. And here's an illustration just looking at the cushion that was left in the back of the house. You can see all the burn marks, so you can get a sense that there was a massive amount of embers thrown at this house. So a little modification would have meant that none of these windows would have needed to be replaced, and this house probably would have done a lot better. And that would be to have incorporated less combustible materials around this house and incorporating what we're going to call Zone 0. Here's another example. This is in Reading with a car fire, and you can see, again, house built to relatively new standards, but combustible mulches and I don't know if this is boxwood or what plant species it is, but embers were able to pass over the street, pass over the green lawn, and then they ignited the combustible mulches that were right next to this house. Again, we had broken windows, broken first panes. We don't know if there was firefighter response that eventually saved this home. I did see some of that in the surrounding neighborhoods around this house, and they luckily were able to retain the home. But a couple little modifications would have made a difference for them in having to do less repair coming forward. So here you can see in the lower left this crack in that first pane of the window. So what is it that, as we think about this, that really drives our California aesthetic? Why do we overplant around our houses? What is it that gives us the idea that that's what's beautiful or important? And this is a question for all of you. If we were in a classroom or in a some kind of room where we could be together, I think we'd talk this through. And I think some of it is, the sort of the Frank Lloyd Wright style construction, the prairie construction, and this idea that the house needs to be anchored so it doesn't look like it's floating, or maybe it's that we don't want to see the foundation, or maybe we just want to make sure it looks lived in and not just freshly plopped on the ground. We need color, we need beauty. But is there some way that we can achieve those things without putting vegetation right next to the house? And I'm going to argue that I think you can. It takes a little creativity, but there's a lot we can do, and that will help for fire performance, but also help the performance of the siding. It will make it easier for maintenance, and it will do a lot for us. So I got sucked into watching Downton Abbey. I don't know if any of you did or not, but here we have, a very beautiful home and not a speck of vegetation around this house. So where's the landscaping? Does that house need it? Why is it that we feel we have to do it? I don't know. Questions to think about. So when I'm talking about zone zero, what does that mean? And the idea is that we're really trying to reduce the chance of flame contact both to the vegetation near the house and to create a place where we don't have ember ignition. The challenge is, and this is two sides of one home, is that we have to think about implementing it on all sides of the house, not just in the back or not just in the front, because we can't predict which direction we're going to have exposure from either embers or direct flame contact. So that means that we're going to be, thinking about new ways to incorporate, a reduced fuel environment. So maybe that's rock mulches, maybe it's hardscape, maybe it's mowed green lawn. And what I'm going to tell you, it's really about right plant, right place, and that's not going to focus as much on plant lists, but more focus on placement and the maintenance of those plants through time. So hardscape can take many forms. It can be artistic, it can be functional, it can be, in lots of different arenas, and I've seen a lot of creative ideas here. But, the idea is that we're really separating the vegetation from the house. So we know that mulch is important to retain moisture. We know it's important to affect weed growth. We know it provides nutrients. We know it does lots of things. But we also know that pretty much every type of mulch will burn, and to some degree. Here's some illustration in the Tubbs fire where you can see that this is almost more of a composted mulch, and it did burn. So when we're getting close to the house, then we're going to be thinking more about using rock mulch or some other form of non-combustible material to provide those services. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in fire-resistant plants, and we all want to buy something that's marketed towards us to meet our needs. And I just want to share with you all that all plants can burn regardless of how they're marketed. It just really depends on how they're maintained. Do they have a proper level of irrigation? Do they get pruned? Do they have, cleanup activities that happen over time? All those functions have to be maintained regardless of how the plant is marketed. And there's been a lot of research into the difficulty with plant lists and the challenge with it. And we can take lavender, for example. So I might plant lavender one year. It's very lush, it's non-woody, but the plant characteristics change through time, don't they, when we're talking about lavender, because it gets woody over time. I might not be good at watering it. I might not be good at pruning it. I might not be good at, annual fall cleanup. And before I know it, I've got a pretty dry, dead plant that has a few flowers and a few bits of green, and it went from being lush and non-woody to suddenly quite susceptible to fire. So when we're thinking about plant lists, and our recommendations are really to focus more on the plant attributes and then where it's going to be planted so that you can maintain it to the best of your abilities. Now, I know a lot of folks are interested in native and drought-tolerant individuals, and they're great for those reasons, but they don't necessarily lend themselves to be any more fire-resistant than any other. So if you're interested in this, there's a reference down here on the bottom. You're welcome to contact me, and I can give you some more information about those reasons why we're not going to put much focus on fire-resistant plants or the marketing of those terms. So what does this mean to change? What does that look like? So coming back to that house in Reading, you know, what I would say to the owner of this house is, why don't we put some hardscaping around the perimeter of the house? Might be a nice place for a lawn chair. And then if you want to be able to have that visual separation, that your landscaping that has some height to it is then in a secondary perimeter around that hardscaping. So we've created separation from the house, but we've maybe given some height so that you can, you know, anchor the home visually as you drive up, maybe conceal the foundation a bit. So, you know, it's kind of flip-flopping what we've been doing. We often put the landscaping next to the house and then put the walkway on the outside of it. Well, if we can put the walkway closer to the house and landscaping on the outside, we've made a huge advancement when it comes to fire and fire performance. I know there's lots of questions coming in, and we'll do our best to pick them up at the end. I'm planning for about 15 minutes of questions, so thank you, and keep putting those in. So really what we're talking about is creating islands of vegetation. We're talking about thinning and pruning taller vegetation. Maybe we're talking about using mounds to create some of that height and some of the visual cover. We're not talking about no vegetation. We're talking about being smart about where we place it, creating some separation for our homes, and then figuring out how to create discontinuity between islands of vegetation so that if you do get fire approaching or you do get a new spot fire, that it just doesn't wick from one plant to the next into the canopy and then onto the house, and you know, create that pathway for bringing fire to the house. We're talking about breaking that process up, keeping true plants where we need them. We can still have shade, we can still have all those attributes, but being a little smarter about how we do that. So let's talk about the vulnerabilities in the house, because the two pieces are very complementary to each other, and there are things that we can do that can accentuate the vulnerabilities in the house by our landscaping, and then there are some other things that we can think about here. I'm mostly going to, in this frame, talk about direct flame contact and ember exposure. The radiant heat piece is super important, but I'm going to try and pick that up at the end. And I'm only going to scratch the surface today on the issues. Now, the information I'm going to share with you comes through two forms. One is through post-evaluations of fires. So I've been on a number of them now in the last couple of years, as well as a research laboratory that's managed by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety in North Carolina. And they have a laboratory big enough that they can build buildings and then expose them to different types of flames or embers, and then be able to evaluate how each component does under this exposed environment. So here you can see a building, there's an ember generator, and you can see where the embers really catch at the ground level of this building, but they also are blasting into the gable end of this building, and so you can get a sense of how the pattern of airflow goes and then where those embers are going to land. The buildings are highly instrumented, so you can see, there's cameras on the inside, there's receptive pieces of material on the inside, so you can look at ember exposure and ember penetration. Really, really pretty fancy, and it's given us a lot of information about what's happening. So there are many points of entry to a house. I'm just going to highlight them briefly here, really just scratching the surface. But let's look at this one, roof-to-wall contact, where you have either a complex roof, where you have two intersecting components of your house, and you've got wall that's on top or intersecting with your roof, or in this case a dormer. Real easy for leaf material or needles to accumulate, and you can imagine how embers can find their way to that accumulation, and all of a sudden you've got fire exposure right next to your siding. Also, you can have rain gutters, really important for protecting your siding from too much water exposure, but those gutters can also become points of accumulation for leaf material and needles. And then if you've got embers, you can easily get fire in your gutters, and depending on how your gutter assembly is done, you can have fire penetrate underneath your roof and get into your attic pretty quickly. Some of you may have thought about fences to houses. We love our fences. You know, fences make great neighbors. They're mostly made of woody materials, which as a forester I'm all for, but fences can also wick to the building directly and cause flames to directly touch the building. And then this bottom image comes from vents in the attic, both the gable end and the under eave vents, and you can see these little sparks coming through those vents, and those are embers that are penetrating the vents. And the horizon line is about this orange line in the middle, just to give you some orientation, because these are dark photographs. But the idea is that our buildings are porous, and by design, but we need to think about what we can do to modify that porosity so that you still get warm, hot air out and moist air out, but you can maybe shut down the process of embers penetrating the building. So those are a lot of concepts, a lot of things to think about. What I want to do is just, you know, sort of help you decouple some of these issues. Our host, Sherida Phibbs, will send a guide, a little short guide at the end of this, so you can start to think about some of the issues yourselves. But when it comes to prioritizing actions around structure survival from wildfire, there are some different categories and there are different issues. The number one issue really is your roof and your roof edge. And I've been struggling as a homeowner. I have a 65-year-old house, and until this fall, I had an original redwood shake roof on it. So I had a lot of issues, and it wasn't worth me working on these other issues until I dealt with my roof. It was an expensive proposition. I knew that, and so it's taken me a while. But recognize that your roof is the biggest determinant of your survival in many ways. Then the vents, and we'll talk about those in a little more detail, and then the vegetation and the defensible space. And this is because we're trying, all three of those are vulnerable to embers. Now, windows, decks, and siding are also important, slightly less, a little bit lower down on the priority list, because all three of those are vulnerable to embers, radiant heat, or direct flame contact. And those can be mitigated through some other actions. They become more or less important in a number of scenarios, though, so I will say if you're on steep slopes, there's some additional issues, or if your homes are really close to each other, there's some additional issues. So the prioritization process shifts around a little bit depending on your setting, and I won't have enough time today to really go through that in detail, but just to recognize that your setting may be unique, and there may be another way to reshuffle this prioritization process based on this. But no matter what, your roof, your vents, and your vegetation are always going to be a high priority in any situation, even if your home is way out by itself or if it's even in a dense neighborhood. So why the roof? Well, the roof is the largest horizontal surface on your building, and your roof has to do an amazing job of keeping the sun out, keeping hail out, maybe dealing with copious amounts of rain, maybe even hail. But the fire rating of your roof is only the roof deck itself. It doesn't relate to these penetrations such as skylights or vents, or the complexities of roof intersections with walls. So there's some more to it when it comes to the roof. And really what we're trying to get people to think about is, where are the weak points? They're often at the roof edge where there can be little gaps. These are with 2 tile roof examples where you can see that there's some gaps, and you can envision that it wouldn't be that hard for vegetation to get stuffed in there, or birds to move vegetation in there, and then embers to follow. And then you've got fire underneath your roof. The formal term for this terracotta tile roof is really bird stops. So it is a real thing that animals will bring little homes to these openings. So the roof needs to be in good shape to provide that important defense for you. And the more complex your roofs are, the more intersections you have, the more places you have for material to get lodged and accumulate. And so this creates exposures to the wall unit, and it won't be protected by the roofing. So there are some modifications that can be done, and in these cases where you would actually harden this wall to increase the fire rating, you do some flashing details. So a small retrofit in either of these situations could improve the overall performance of the wall in the dormer setting or in this complex roof example. And if you're building from scratch, the more simple your roof lines are, hey, there's much less maintenance that needs to be managed. But you can also basically design some additional robustness into this from the beginning as well. So number 2, the vents. So vents are really important because what they do is they allow the warm, moist air that gets into your house to and penetrates through your ceiling to have a pathway out. It also lets cool air to come in, so there's a whole circulation pattern with vents, so vents are very important. But what we're trying to get people to do is get vents that have become more like Gore-Tex, where they let that warm moisture out in your coat, but then they keep the rain and the snow from coming in. And so the neat part is that there's been some new vent designs and some new modifications that can be retrofitted in or designed in from scratch. So, I showed you this image earlier, and so what we're trying to create is a way to protect the inside of the house from penetration by these embers through these vents. So the majority of our homes are built with 1/4-inch mesh, which is pretty porous, which is good because it's easy to fill 1/4-inch mesh with paint. So if you're spraying your house, you can clog up something that's a little tighter. So we need to be careful about not clogging up a tighter screen mesh. But if you manage to remove the vegetation and things that can ignite right next to the house and right next to the vents, a real simple solution is to upgrade to 1/8-inch mesh screening. And that can be done over the top of the existing 1/4-inch mesh screening. So a combination. Very low cost retrofit, assuming that you are not going to have flame penetration of those vents. If that's not possible, or there are more complexities, there are these new design vents that basically will both resist embers as well as resist flame penetration. So the one on the top here has a honeycomb mesh that when it's heated, it actually melts and seals up. The one in the middle here, this baffle design, it's sort of a tortuous path, and so the embers will bounce around, but they don't penetrate all the way through. Let's see, there's steel wool mesh that's in these through roof vents. So there's some new designs. This vent costs about $25. It's a foundation vent, so depending on how big your structure is, you can use that to kind of estimate what it would cost to do a vent upgrade. This gable end vent, both of these are in the like 120 range. So small cabin, probably not a big not a huge financial investment. Larger, more complex house, the costs increase, and it really, what I'm going to recommend is it depends on how much you can control and how much risk you can manage. So if you're building new, this is the kind of vents you'll be required to install if you're in a wildland urban interface zone, not in a municipal city setting, but there are some opportunities. Decks. I'm a lover of redwood. I'm a lover of decks. I like to be outside. Many of us have decks. They are vulnerable both to direct flame contact as well as embers, depending on what's on them. So if you're in a position where you're going to be upgrading a deck, I just want to put a message out that there's some new guidance around how to build decks that will be of benefit to you. And it's really about items like putting a non-combustible deck board adjacent to the siding, and then using a foil-faced metal tape on the deck joists, and increasing the gaps between boards to 1/4 inch, and then building in 24 inches on center. A little harder to retrofit those things in, but if it's time to upgrade your deck, then there's some items that you can be thinking about in terms of new construction. The number one issue with decks, though, is to remove the combustible materials from underneath the deck. I know it's very tempting. All of us want to store materials underneath our decks, out of sight, out of mind, or a little bit of protection from the elements. But if that catches on fire, catches your deck on fire, it's pretty hard to protect your home in that setting. So, fence to house, here's an example from Coffee Park. You can see how the fence was able to bring fire to the house on the right. So what do you do about that? Well, still build with wood and build a wooden fence, but as it comes to the attachment point, change that to metal so that if the fence catches on fire, it won't wick it directly to the house. So small modification might make a big difference depending on your setting. So that's just some high-level, ideas. Hopefully I've scratched some of your thinking process around the types of exposures, and then there's a lot more to how to mitigate those. But as you think about risk, there are things that you can do. So radiant heat, and I just want to say I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is really difficult if your homes are close to each other. And so your neighbor's condition can have a huge determinant on your own survival. And so when you live in tight neighborhoods, there definitely is a need for people to work together. There are some ways to increase the wall resistance to heat from that radiant heat component. And there's ways to upgrade windows to tempered glass. There's also deployable metal shutters that you can use to close if you're in an evacuation time. So there are things you can do when you're in these tight neighborhood settings. But the best thing to start with is figuring out how to work together. So as I conclude, and I want to make sure, because I can see there's a lot of questions here, let me just bring it back home. So, the question is, what are we waiting for? Why is it that we haven't done the actions that we know are important? For me, it was, hey, I had to refinance my house to replace my roof, and I get it. Some of this stuff is very expensive. Some of it isn't. I think part of it is, though, related to this idea that we have a fighting force, for example. Why is it that we have a force that's specifically designed to protect us with a term that we know they can't do in all times, right? We don't fight earthquakes, and we don't fight tornadoes, and we don't fight hurricanes. What do we do in those settings? Well, we adapt and we build smarter, right? So when it comes to fire, I feel like we've kind of been stuck in this mode that there's always going to be someone in uniform or someone volunteering in uniform who's going to come and risk their lives to help us. And so maybe there are things that we can do to help them help us. And so how do we shift that mentality to think about what's within our responsibility line that we can have control over? And I don't know what that answer is for you, but these are the kinds of things that I'm working on. And I'm really trying to reorient my perspective to recognize that these embers are the issue that I really need to prioritize and I haven't been paying attention to. I know that the new construction codes are helping, and I know they're out there, and I know we need to figure out how do we as a society incentivize upgrades to existing homes. And it's kind of similar to the stuff that we're talking about when it comes to COVID-19 and herd immunity and what percentage of the population needs to be taken care of. Well, what percentage of the population of homes in your neighborhood need to be taken care of? Can we buffer someone who can't handle it? How do we protect our most vulnerable? How do we protect those that are low income and are elderly, and these are complicated things? I think we're fundamentally going to have to work together. It's taken 150 years to build the homes that we have in California. We're not going to change overnight, but I'm hopeful that we can really pivot to resiliency, because wildfire is not going away in less than 150 years. And I'm confident we can do that when we figure out how to, adapt and be a little smarter about what we do. You're going to see through time that there's going to be some new changes, and the Defensible Space Code is likely to change to really incorporate this 5-foot zone, whether we call it Zone 0, the Ember Defense Zone, the noncombustible zone. We can take it on voluntarily, or code and regulation will change and encourage us to do that in a more regulatory framework. So things to start to pay attention to. And as I conclude, I think it's possible to have beauty, safety, privacy, and and resistance to drought and all of those things. And it's it's about the right plant in the right place. And then when it comes to the home, the design, maintenance, and construction is really more important than any particular fire-resistant building product. It's about all the little details. And poor installation or a lack of maintenance can fundamentally overwhelm any building product, no matter how it's rated. So thinking in a systems viewpoint, thinking about the type of exposures you're likely to have and preparing for those requires, this kind of integrated strategy and complementary strategy between the landscaping and the home and the landscaping conversely. So as I conclude here, I've got a number of resources and websites to look at, and there's a lot to this. We're trying to really push out and build more fluency in the general population around these terms. So you'll see more websites that start to get at these materials. So there's some at our shop, University of California. The Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has really powerful videos to help, share this information with your neighbors, your family members. So the Disaster Safety website can link you into some of those videos. The National Fire Protection Association has a great number of fact sheets on individual components and how to think about mitigations when it comes to those individual components. And then if you're interested in building a new construction and you want to know what the standards are, here's the links to the California New Code for the Wildland Urban Interface, the WUI Chapter 7A construction standards, and where you can see how different products perform and what's approved. So, there's no silver bullet out there, but I think together we can start to rethink about resiliency with fire and about the fact that fire is part of this landscape. California adapted as an ecosystem to many different types of fire exposures, and now we've just sort of interrupted that process by putting our homes in it and then trying to control as many fires as possible, which has been good for us in the past. It may not be so good for us going forward. So thank you for being a very patient audience. And I am looking forward to this really in-depth chat box. So maybe Sherida, you can help me through this, because there has been a lot of, I can see a lot of things flashing. So where should we start?
Yeah, there's several questions. One of the earlier ones, actually there was a couple that asked about, in the 5-foot zone, would succulent planting around that area, would it be advantageous?
With succulents, that's a great question. So what will happen, assuming that this new legislation goes forward, is that there'll be an enhanced conversation between the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. So I can't predict exactly what's going to come out of that process. But what I'll say is, not all succulents are the same. Some are really slow growing and they don't thatch a lot. But let's take ice plant, for example. And maybe you like ice plant, maybe you think it's invasive, I don't know. But ice plant builds up a lot of thatch underneath it. And so there's a lot of dead material with ice plant. So if you're going to choose a succulent, and I love succulents, choose one that doesn't have a lot of dead material and dead accumulation. And so that's why I'm okay when it comes to like a well-maintained green lawn right around that section, because it's not going to be combustible. Or if you, for example, have more of a cabin setting and you really don't have much landscaping, then you're going to want to weed whack as much as you can, as low as you can, so that you may have a little bit of stubble left in there, but that won't last if it catches on fire for more than a few seconds. Great question.
Great. Another question was, someone was told that well-rotted compost, to use it as mulch because it's non-flammable. Is that true?
Right. Well, I don't know that every element has been tested. I think the more soil-like it becomes, the more organics, that it becomes more like soil, the less likely it will to have flame. But, the bark mulches, the coil rope, the redwood hair, the more air exposure, the more penetration capacity, then the more likely that you can get an ignition. Then the deeper it is, the longer the duration the fire is. So in general, composts make more sense than those other materials. I can't see, without knowing the setting, it's hard to say with, the Good Housekeeping Seal of America that that's the perfect and right answer to do. So it's going to be an it depends answer. It's certainly better than nothing. If you're in a very fire-prone area, I would be moving to the more extreme tactics where you're using rock mulch or, doing some, really trying to put your hardscaping right next to your house.
Okay, how about with water conservation being so important these days and the sustainability of lawns? That's how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of trade-offs and lots of issues, and I totally get the idea that we need to do everything we can to be as smart about our water usage. Without knowing the context, the setting of the house itself, I think I'm a little bit about trying to find that more modern aesthetic myself, where more is less. Well-placed, smaller, beautiful items may make more sense than continuous, thick, complicated gardens. And so, I fundamentally understand why we need to be conserving water and being smart about that. In some coastal communities where there's, more water availability, I live in Arcata. I have a green lawn year round regardless of whether I irrigate or not. But that doesn't mean that my home won't be vulnerable to fire at some point in some time. So I'm okay with my lawn staying where it is. And the reason I'm concerned that I live in Arcata about fire is that when we're in conditions to burn in California on the coast, so is the rest of the state. And the rest of the state's been there for an awfully long time. We may have a fewer number of days on the coast that are in those conditions. But if we have ignitions in other parts of the state, we have a complicated and well-designed system to manage and move fire personnel to be able to handle those big events. And they keep some folks at home. But if we're on the coast, it's a good chance, and there's fire somewhere else, that our crews, or the majority of our crews, are somewhere else. So we don't have the kind of volume of crews that may be needed for our particular response. So it's important, even if you live in an environment where you think you might get less frequency in fire, to be thinking about fluency around this topic and trying to be able to mitigate these issues to the best of your abilities. And, I know this is a Humboldt State University audience, but in the North Coast, the wind event that kicked off the Tubbs fire and the fire in Mendocino and all the fires in Sonoma, that wind event hit here in Humboldt the same day. It hit us about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we had utility lines down in Blue Lake. We still had our helicopter here, and we still had a lot of crews here, and so they were able to do direct response and get on that fire. The fires that and the wind events that caused the North Bay complex kicked off in the evening around 9 o'clock at night. So had those reversed, we likely would not have had crews available here because it was such a big event in Sonoma that we pushed as many crews to that community as we could to help those folks. So timing really matters, and time of year matters, and overall condition in California matters. So, how we manage these issues, to me, are an all California issue. There really are no protected spaces when it comes to it in California.
Okay. Another question when it comes to water conservation, a lot of us has been putting in California natives, and as we all know, they have a tendency sometimes to be a little more flammable. So what is your thought on California native plants?
I love California native plants. For me, as long as you're implementing Zone 0, use native plants, and as long as you can try, if fire is the thing that you're worried about, and I'm trying to suggest why you should be worried about it, as long as you can try and, create discontinuity between your garden beds and your planting beds so that, one is not going to move to the next. The fire is not going to move from one garden bed to the next, or not going to move into the crowns and the canopies of the trees. Use natives, absolutely. And I mean, they're great for pollinators. They're great for all these other reasons. Less invasive, yeah. But just don't assume that a native is more fire resilient or more fire resistant.
Okay. Next question. Someone's asking about a layman's version of the building codes. Do you know if one exists that's easy to read?
I'm right with you. That California Chapter 7A is a bear to get through, and I try to avoid it at all costs, I'll be honest. I'm hopeful that I can, try and encourage the Office of the Fire Marshal to get there, but it's difficult. Essentially, if you are into new construction, then you could be, working with your building department and your permit, or working with your contractors, it's a bear. And the other thing to say about our construction codes is they do change through time, and so as new information comes in, they do change through time. So if you're thinking about it now but might not get to it till 5 years from now, there could be some modifications to the standards at that point.
I am still searching for the next question, but one that I keep seeing all the time, which I can answer, is about this presentation, if it's going to be recorded. It is recorded, and I will be putting it up on our virtual class page of our website, and I will be following up this presentation with an email with a link to that website page with all of the different resources that has been mentioned in this presentation. So I don't know, Yana, can you see if I've missed anything here?
Yeah, I'm looking through the questions here. I guess I need to go to the bottom. I guess really I want to come back to those, those things about what's holding you back. And I'm going to throw my mother under the bus because I'm a daughter. I get to do that, right? I think it's so easy to deflect the problem to somewhere else. The open space district's not managing this. The city's not managing this. So therefore, it's really their problem. And in reality, what can we control? We can only control the things that are within our responsibility. And we can try and inspire others, and we can try and be leaders in our communities. We can try and be leaders to our neighbors. And, I guess the question is, what are you going to regret? I really feel for the community of Reading. I mean, they watched the car fire for 3 days. They saw it off in the flanks. And, I think we, as a society, all sort of think that our urban environments are really protected, and that, we've got an urban fire force and they're going to do everything they can, and that it can't happen here. The reality is that these things can happen, and they can happen very quickly, and you may not have the time to prepare in all the ways you want. And so now's the time to start. Take the vent challenge. Take the 0 to 5 challenge. As a community, why don't you and your neighbors and your friends work on 0 to 5 together as a community as a first step? Second step might be the vents. Take off bite-sized bits that are achievable for you, things that you can do, so that you're putting your family and your community in a better position, so that if something terribly goes wrong, you have a place that you can shelter in place if you have to, because you didn't get enough time for an evacuation warning. I mean, think about the folks in Sonoma County. They often just didn't get an evacuation warning because their phones were off, the phone communication went down, and the only warning they really got was, smoke in the air and waking up to, sirens or something to that effect. You have so little time in some situations. So the more stuff you can do on a yearly basis that puts your home and your property and your family in the best position, the better off you'll be. And, hopefully you'll never be put to that challenge. But, what are you going to regret if you did, if you are put to that challenge? The other components, I didn't talk at all about evacuation. I didn't talk about go bags. I didn't talk about the other elements of warnings and alerts. There's a lot of folks that are doing great communication on those pieces. They're in many ways no different than the tsunami preparedness that we have to think about in the North Coast, or the earthquake preparedness that we think about throughout California. But if you're in a rural setting, there may be some additional components, like where I grew up, I have a single lane access road. I've got a couple gates I got to get through. If I'm evacuating, which I sure hope I am, and evacuating early enough, there may be wind thrown trees that are across the road, so my go bag might include a chainsaw. My go bag might include some bolt cutters, because maybe there's some other way that I'm forced to try and go through my neighbor's property and they have a gate. I want to make sure that I've got clothing that if I'm caught out is not going to catch me on fire. So I'm going to make sure that in my go bag is, a good hat that's going to protect my head from embers, good, leather gloves, making sure I have non-combustible fabric. I'm not evacuating in my leggings and my flip-flops, but in boots and jeans and with cotton clothing on or wool clothing, so thinking in rural environments might be a little different than thinking in urban environments. We're racing into fire season. Our fire season extends, well into November. So there's a lot of time between now and November to take action. So if you got questions, you can, run them through these websites as a first pass. There's a network of folks in California that are happy to try and answer them to the best of, our abilities. And, we're happy to provide presentations to other communities, either through these distance-based techniques or, when COVID restrictions lift, in person. So, we really are here to help within the University of California and are, actively trying to be a good partner and thinking through these issues. Maybe I'll just take this one verbally if someone's still listening. There's a question about what happens when you're on small lots, and there's only so much that you can maintain. And, I think the same concepts apply, whether you're on a large lot or a small lot. And, I get that on a smaller lot you have fewer options, but there are things that you can do both to harden the home to that radiant heat exposures, as well as sort of manage those issues associated with ember exposure. So, it's not, I'm not suggesting that you need to have, no vegetation, but maybe it's a little bit smarter choices, keeping that vegetation away from windows, from underneath the vents. Those kinds of things are important. I've got another question here about wisteria and whether wisteria would be resilient because they've got an arbor. Well, and I would say probably not, and depends on what the arbor is made out of. The arbor may be, also made of a combustible material. So again, in that setting, both of those would probably create some risk and exposure.
This is such great information to take back and to study and to learn more about. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I will be sending out an email, as I mentioned, that will have the link to the page of our website where you will find the recording of this video, as well as all of the resources that are mentioned in this presentation. And with that, thank you, Yana. Thank you, Victoria and HSU, for allowing us during these last 5-6 weeks to be a part of your presentations. We have thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone. And to your health and safety.